Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Wood, a member of the CMC Board of Trustees and principal of IBI Group. It's great to see everyone here today. Today's forum, What the Muck? Managing Ohio's Freshwater Assets, is particularly timely as water certainly seems to be in the news on a daily basis. Please help me thank the Ohio State University for their partnership throughout the year and particularly of their support of today's important topic. Our panelists are passionate about water and its many uses, for agriculture, recreation, to support aquatic life, as a resource for industry and human populations, and ultimately to support life itself. How we use water, how it is stored, transported, or recycled, and how it is responsibly and sustainably interconnected to all of these things is what we hope to learn about today. Bruce McFerrin, Dean of the OSU College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences, was unable to join us today due to illness. We will miss him, but we still have an excellent panel to cover our topic. Please welcome Jeffrey M. Reuter, recently retired but still active, former director of OSU's F.T. Stone Laboratory on Lake Erie, Eugene C. Bragg, program director, Aquatic Ecosystems at OSU Extension School of Environment and Natural Resources, and Tony Logan, who we literally grabbed as he walked in the door, and he agreed to serve on our panel for us. Tony is the state director of the USDA Rural Development Agency. Please thank our speakers. Oh, I'm sorry, and the person, the person in Columbus who brings science to kids and adults in our community every day, today's host and moderator, the president and CEO of the Center of Science and Industry, David Chesbrough. David, the podium is yours.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Well, good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to be here with a lot of people who've actually used COSI as a forum for helping communicate these issues. So we're back at the topic of water, which I think because of our blessing of where our geography is, seemed like it wasn't an issue. I joke. People asked me when I came to Columbus, "Where are you from?" And because they knew I'd come down from Buffalo, and I said, "Well, I'm originally from Cleveland." And then I followed that up immediately, but I left when the lake was dead and the river was on fire. And I swore I'd never go back. Well, the interesting aspect is that we had a family connection. We ended up for 23 years on Lake Erie with all my children. And by the time we got back to Lake Erie, it was robust. Now my grandchildren are being taken to the lake by my daughters who want to relive their experiences. But now we're worried again about the water. So it's been interesting to watch that ebb and flow. And water is a huge issue, whether we're talking about California drought or the like, but it is a local issue in many ways. Some of you saw the Dispatch, ironically. The Dispatch had a great article on Jeff and his career in Stone Lab. And so I think I'm going to open us up with a question that brings water closer to home from the fact that it's a worldwide issue. And so my initial question that I'd like each of our conversationalists to address is, what do you think is our biggest concern at this point related to the current water quality problems in Lake Erie? So we'll just go starting with Tony, who's had the least time to prepare for this. So,
well, thank you, David. And for all you Metropolitan Club members, this is a cautionary tale about what Jane Scott will do with you if you come in without a tie. But I'm actually delighted to jump in for Bruce McFerrin, who we collaborate with a great deal through USDA. U.S. Department of Agriculture has several agencies that are very intimately involved with the whole water crisis in the northwestern Lake Erie and Lake Erie basins, and we, I think in a way the Toledo water crisis may turn out to be, David, sort of the Cuyahoga Fire moment for us in terms of agriculture and other water users being mobilized to fix a serious problem up there. So we're certainly entering into this engaged and optimistic that all hands will be on deck to help solve this problem. And our footprint is pretty large in that area in farming and agricultural related activities. We have the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is the conservation arm of USDA, that has about $17 million up there in the basin, including Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana, to provide conservation cost share activities and resources to fund things like buffer strips, cover crops, et cetera. The Farm Service Agency is the agency within USDA that administers the farm programs and loans and crop supports, et cetera. And they ensure conservation cross compliance. So if a farmer wants to participate in these farm programs, they need to have conservation compliance and conservation plans, et cetera, in place for the federal program. And then my agency, Rural Development Agency, provides funding in water and environmental programs, including sanitary sewer and clean water projects. And one of those involves just last year we closed a $3 million upgrade of the Bayview sanitary sewer system, which looks right out on the bay. And that's part of the solution as well, is making sure these water systems run clean.
Eugene?
So, if I answer honestly, I'm afraid I'll steal all of my esteemed colleague Jeff Reuter's thunder. So I will answer very simply that I think regarding the quality of Lake Erie and the greatest threats to the quality of Lake Erie right now, I would argue, I think pretty easily, that the availability of nutrients is tied so intimately to so many other problems on Lake Erie. But I don't want to elaborate too greatly, again, because I don't want to steal Dr. Reuter's thunder. Instead, I'll talk a little bit about a perhaps second greatest concern, and that's aquatic invasive species. Okay, so aquatic invasive species, depending upon who's doing the counting and how they're counting, we have more than 190 different species of organisms to have become established in the Great Lakes from someplace else. As many as 136 to Lake Erie, almost 150 within the state of Ohio. And when you think about the source of your food. Where does your food originate? For the most part, when we're talking about fruits, vegetables, meats, we're talking about agriculture. Agriculture is extremely important. We don't want to do anything to tie the hands of agriculture to the point that it's going to limit the availability of food. But there's one big exception, and that exception is fish and seafood. By and large, the greatest source of fish and seafood are still wild and very important to protect. So when I think about the aquaculture industry, for example, in Ohio, it's a small industry. Most of it goes to producing bait and sport fish for stocking into recreational waters. Very little of it goes to food, because even in freshwater, the production of food from aquaculture systems cannot compete with the availability of wild fish. Lake Erie produces a tremendous number of yellow perch on the Ohio side of the lake, and walleye on the Canadian side of the lake. So fisheries, tremendously important to protect, and under constant threat from invasive species. There are a number of threats, potential legal threats right now to how we manage invasive species that we can elaborate on in conversation if you'd like. But so instead of the greatest concern, I've more thoroughly addressed the second greatest concern.
And Asian carp will be a big part of that discussion, I'm sure, throughout the lunch hour today. David, when I think about that question, I'll go back to maybe the way you started with the burning of the Cuyahoga River. You know, at that time we were putting in 29,000 metric tons of phosphorus into Lake Erie. Our models that we did right at Ohio State produced told us that we needed to reduce that loading to 11,000 to turn the loading the lake around, about a 60% reduction. We did it by improving sewage treatment. The lake responded, became the walleye capital of the world. Starting about 1995, our loading of nutrients, so excessive nutrient loading, returned, started to increase. Our phosphorus concentrations are back up right now to where they were in the 1970s. The harmful algal blooms have returned. So we've really, you know, in the course of my career, we've gone full circle from the dead lake to the walleye capital of the world, and now we're headed back in the opposite direction. Maybe the good news in this, Senate Bill 150 last year, Senate Bill 1 this year, changes in the attitude on the part of farmers. The fact that we have 5 states, a province, 2 countries bordering the lake, people understand it now. They get it. It may be the key moment may have been, I thought it was 2013 when we had the Carroll water treatment plant near Davis-Besse closed down, but that only impacted 2,000 people, so not many people heard about it. But when Toledo shut down, that got everybody's attention.
So let's, this is a great introduction to what you think, but let's talk, let's pick up on what you were saying and what Tony was talking about, and we can work the species in, because again, it's an ecosystem, and you always have to look at these things as systems, which is always the challenge, I think, for us as educators and scientists to have people not just focus on an individual element, but see these things as systems. But what's it going to take to get the lake to full health? Anyone go ahead.
Well, it depends on how you define full health. The lake's never going to be what it was before European settlement. Never. It can't be. Some species have been completely lost from the lake. The food webs, the way the lake functions biologically, the way it produces organisms that people value, are irreversibly changed. So it really, that's a kind of a loaded question without an easy answer, because mostly it's hard to define the terms of the question.
I would answer that in a couple of different ways. First, we know reducing phosphorus loading primarily from the Maumee River. That's the largest contributor, drains 4.5 million acres of agricultural land. That's where your greatest amount of phosphorus, highest concentration is coming in. That's what drives harmful algal blooms. That's what ultimately creates the dead zone in the central basin of Lake Erie. If we reduce that by 40%, so it's a smaller reduction than we had in the 1960s, we reduce it by 40%, we essentially solve the problem. We know, this is a key point to keep in mind, we know from the drought of 2012, if you recall, 2011 was the wettest year of the last 50. 2012, very next year, the driest year of the last 50. The amount of phosphorus went down by 90%. The blooms went away. It happened that quickly. And the reason it can happen that quickly is because Lake Erie is the smallest by volume of the Great Lakes, southernmost, shallowest, warmest. The western basin, where 95% of all the water flows into Lake Erie, average depth 24 feet. It contains only 5% of the volume of the water in the whole lake. If we look at retention time for water in Lake Erie, about 2.6, 2.7 years, but retention time for water in the western basin is 20 to 50 days. That's where the harmful algal blooms occur. So if you reduce phosphorus loading, the blooms go away. The question for us as a society discussion is, how long does it take us to reduce phosphorus loading while maintaining agricultural production? Agriculture is where the majority of the phosphorus comes from now, which is different than the problem we had in the 70s when it was then incredibly poor sewage treatment. Now it comes from a lot of sources, but the majority is from agriculture, but we want to keep ag production very high. And it's possible to do both, and that has to be our goal.
Tony, sounds like an opening for you.
Right. Well, to achieve the goals that Jeff just outlined in phosphorus reduction, we're obviously going to need strong participation by farmers in the basin, but as well as governments and water treatment plants, et cetera. But in terms of bringing the agricultural community into the best management practices, that's already a lot of activity already on the ground through extension and others both at the state and federal level. And we can accomplish this with it will take some major and incremental changes, but not revolutionary changes in the way farmers do business. And then we need to obviously motivate the farmers through, hopefully not through stringent regulations, but through voluntary compliance, with the necessity of achieving that goal in the short term, because it's certainly a public policy issue of the highest magnitude. And what happens if they don't reach that? I think we can look to the state of Iowa recently, where the water treatment system of Des Moines, Iowa, actually brought a lawsuit against the upriver water systems that were feeding what they alleged were agricultural runoff into the municipal water system for Des Moines. And there's a lot of finger pointing and litigation going on there, and we don't want to be those guys. So hopefully we can get this done through a comprehensive program of voluntary compliance with farmers in the basin.
So what I heard is that we do have some levers, one being this Maumee River, West Basin, agricultural runoff. That gives us opportunities. Eugene, you brought up another concern. I'm wondering, are these two separate worlds, or are these concerns interlinked at all? Obviously, when we affect an ecosystem, you have all sorts of ramifications, many unintended. So how does the invasive species, because to your point, we might be talking clean versus healthy, and healthy might be healthy as best as it could be, or healthy, as you've said, we can't get back to healthy the way it was in the virgin land and virgin waters. So how does this maybe interconnect?
So obviously, it's all interconnected. Think about how food webs operate, for example. You need some source of nutrient in the water. That water is going to produce something green. That green stuff is going to be the base of all the biological energy that happens from the algae right up to the big fish that people value. Okay? So let's take a good example. The zebra mussels, which actually have been largely replaced by a close relative called the quagga mussel, but they kind of happen quietly under the radar of most people who aren't nerds and don't pay very careful attention to such things. You put an animal like that, so think about the snakehead, for example. Snakehead was an invasive species, got a lot of attention recently in the east of the US. Big predatory fish, it eats other fish. People directly see how that has an impact, but think of, again, a food pyramid. Snakehead's operating close to the top. He's going to have direct influences on the things around him. You introduce something like a zebra or a quagga mussel, which is a very efficient planktivore, operating at the base of the food web, and they have the potential to take the productivity of that pyramid and narrow the amount of energy that goes all the way up to the top, because they're removing the very base of the food web. Another problem with those organisms is that they like green algae, they like diatoms, they like things that, in general, the rest of the system likes. Not a lot of stuff in the world can ingest the organisms that we call harmful algal blooms. Okay, so these things are selectively removing green algae, diatoms, by grazing. The stuff they don't like, they bundle up in a little mucousy ball called pseudofeces and spit it out. So they're selectively removing competition for nutrients, which potentially has the possibility of influencing, of enhancing harmful algal blooms. So the whole system, it's a system. It is a system. It's all connected very intimately.
So that opens up some further questions. So let's take the Maumee River. Let's say we can address that. What other steps do we need to be conscious of to continue to move Lake Erie to a point where I can take my grandkids and not worry about checking the water, the water quality of the day, and based on the winds and the tides and everything else. Obviously, there's no tides on Lake Erie, but we take them to the ocean too. Go ahead. Anyone?
We really can't focus entirely on the Maumee River. That's important. And if you look at well, first, it's important to recognize how the Lake Erie watershed differs from the watersheds of the other 4 Great Lakes. And the bottom line is that we have the most agriculture and the least forest. The other lakes are dominated by forest ecosystems. That automatically tells you that the other lakes are going to get less sediment and less nutrients coming in. We're also the smallest by volume. In fact, Lake Superior is 25 times larger in volume than Lake Erie. If we think about Lake Erie, southernmost, shallowest, warmest, and getting the most nutrients because of the kind of watershed we have with a lot of agriculture, we should be the most productive, and we are. Produce more fish for human consumption each year than the other 4 combined. sort of a 50 and 2 rule I like to use with people. Lake Superior's got 50% of all the water in the Great Lakes, but only 2% of the fish. Lake Erie has 2% of the water and 50% of the fish. That's really the way that sort of the extremes in the systems. The vast majority of our water comes in out of the Detroit River. About 90% comes in out of that river. The biggest tributary to all the Great Lakes is the Maumee, but it brings in only 3%. But it brings in actually more phosphorus than comes in out of the Detroit River. So the Detroit brings in 90% of the water and less phosphorus that comes in out of the Maumee. But when we look at the other tributaries around the lake, from Monroe, Michigan to Sandusky, you're going to drain 7.2 million acres of agricultural land. We actually get more phosphorus per acre flowing into Sandusky Bay than comes into Maumee Bay at Toledo. Cuyahoga River at Cleveland brings in a much smaller amount of phosphorus, but still an incredibly important river from other contaminants that come in from that river. And then when we think of the value of tourism around Lake Erie, you got $13 billion industry, 119,000 jobs just in Ohio related to tourism on the South Shore. 20 or 30% of all tourism in Ohio is in the 8 counties on, bordering Lake Erie. So the importance of these other tributaries, the Black River, the Cuyahoga, the Chagrin, not going to have the same impact on the whole lake, but have an incredibly important impact on the local economies in each one of those counties.
So that brings up maybe another area, and that is, we started off with Lake Erie, but we really started with the topic of water and its health and its importance in Ohio. What about, if we fix certain parts of this, like the Maumee River and Lake Erie, at the same time we have Buckeye Lake with its algae blooms and others. So let's start looking around the state, because do we fix just one, or are there practices in place or consciousness in place or laws in place that are going to have broader impact than fixing pushing on that one lever that might get the immediate concerns in Lake Erie? And so maybe, Tony, you can start on that.
Well, I'll start at least. We've had some experience, kind of seat of the pants experience, but nonetheless experience with Grand Lake St. Mary, which had harmful algae blooms with some regularity over the past 5 or 6 years. And we've brought some resources to bear there, but you can't manage what you can't measure, and I think we still need to pay more attention and have more resources going into measuring the runoff from farm fields in those basins, whether it's Buckeye Lake, Grand Lake, St. Mary, West Basin, Lake Erie. And if Bruce McFerrin was here, I think he would tell us about some of the great edge of field testing that they're doing, which is maybe just a tributary or even a ditch, and monitor 24/7, 365 how much nutrient comes off of a field, and then start comparing those and use big data to tie it all together. And it's not going to be a magic bullet, but at least it gives our public policy leaders some places to suggest new focuses of activity.
Certainly, and with the right tools, the problem is availability of nutrients, mostly phosphorus, mostly soluble phosphorus. And if you can fix that as a source to the 10,000 square miles of surface water of Lake Erie, you're likely to be able to fix that to any inland lake we have in Ohio as well, if you can identify the source and quantify it with the right tools. I'd like to add that so Ohio, a lot of people forget that we have lakes other than Lake Erie. We've got about 110 natural lakes around the state. But in addition to that, we have about 1,800 reservoirs that would be called lake regulatorily within the state. So 1,800 lakes. We're a pretty water-rich state, and we sometimes take water for granted just because we live in such an abundance of it. Now, Grand Lake, St. Mary's, and Buckeye Lake that have gotten a lot of recent press are kind of the exception to our reservoirs. These are very old sites that were built in essence to retain water to supply canals in the 19th century. Kind of a rarity in our landscape. Some of our lakes have been built for water supply. Hoover Reservoir near to Columbus is an excellent example of that, but most of our lakes within Ohio, most of our artificial lakes within Ohio were built to absorb floodwaters, as flood control sites. And Alum Creek is an excellent example of that, very near to Columbus here. In spite of the fact that these things have different primary purposes, recreation on these lakes is still also very important, and reducing the water quality reduces the willingness of people to access these lakes for fishing, for swimming, for boating. And fixing these lakes is important too.
I think it's important also to recognize that the problem we're having is not limited to Ohio or limited to Lake Erie. We're seeing, I believe it's now all 50 states are showing some kind of problem with excessive nutrient loading, harmful algal blooms, and keep in mind that the algae don't care where the nutrients come from, whether it's poor sewage treatment or fertilizer, manure, septic tanks, all of those sources around the country have caused problems. U.S. and Canada, Lake Winnipeg, big problem. We have huge problems in Lake St. Clair. The Thames River that flows into Lake St. Clair forms a large algae bloom each year. Around the world, people have been killed by the toxins that the algae produce. So this is very much a global issue.
And Jeff, you were starting to tell me a little bit about some of the new initiatives. I was hearing from some of our colleagues here that measuring tools, procedures. It sounds like there are some efforts in this direction.
Yeah, that's important. I can easily show that the major source now is agriculture. And right away, people can jump to the conclusion that the farmers are wasting phosphorus. And that's not the case. In fact, we're actually producing about 3 times as much corn per unit of phosphorus as we did back in the 1970s. So we're a lot more efficient at it. When I first started talking about this in the early 2000s, the farming community were in complete denial. They felt that it couldn't be them because they weren't putting on more phosphorus. But that has totally changed now, to the point that the Farm Bureau is in line in supporting the actions that we're recommending for farmers. The new initiatives that you're talking about, the Board of Regents allocated $2 million to the universities in the state, led by Ohio State and the University of Toledo. The universities matched that funding, put $4 million into 18 projects, focused in five different focus areas. So we're looking at early warning systems to help Toledo and Sandusky. Those would be the 2 most likely places to have water quality issues. Cleveland, not likely to have the problems, and better detection capability and 4 water intakes. We're also looking at new ways or improvements for our water treatment plants and our sewage treatment plants. We're looking at new policies. How could we address this, not with regulations, but maybe with economics? What kind of levers can we turn to impact the way farmers work? Then Bruce McPherson, I wish Bruce was here, because he really stepped up and took $1 million from the ag budget at Ohio State and invested in an initiative they call Field to Faucet. And that effort is focused trying to come up with literally new technology to remove nitrogen and phosphorus from manure, because I will speak a lot about phosphorus, but nitrogen is also critically important. The toxins produced by the algae are 14% nitrogen by weight. And if we could reduce the amount of nitrogen, we can actually make the algae less toxic. And so that would be an important project. Also, new technology, new probes that would allow us to measure algal toxins very quickly. One of the big problems with the Toledo water crisis last year was that every time we took a sample, it took us 6 hours to determine what the toxin concentration was within that particular sample. And when people want their water on right away, and literally, if you think about the water treatment system for 400,000 people in Toledo, we would collect a sample, and that sample had to be collected throughout the water system. You can't simply go to the water treatment plant and find out, is the water treatment plant putting out safe water? You have to go to the farthest reaches in the system and make sure the water that's in all the pipes has also now reached a safe level to drink. Run all over the city, bring all those back, and then take 6 hours to analyze it. And then when you found that it still was too high, then you'd have to send everybody out and repeat the process. And you don't want to get just one safe sample. You want to get a couple of them before you can tell people it's safe to drink. So that would be incredibly, if we can come up with this technology, if we come up with this probe that we can stick it in the water and it tells us what the toxin concentration is, huge improvement.
Quick follow-on to Jeff's comment. I heard one of the managers of the Toledo water treatment plant speak recently, and he said that last year during the crisis, they had one of the monitoring boys deployed out by the water intake, and this year they will have 30 deployed all the way around, and they can monitor when that the algae bloom is nearing the intake. And I know the Stone Lab researchers, where Jeff used to work, are helping to develop that system of early warning.
Well, great. The time for us to have our conversation is ending. It's time to let our folks in the audience have a moment. So in a few minutes, we're going to move to the audience questions. But please allow me the honor of asking the first question to give people a chance to get up to the mic and get ready. So we've talked statewide, we've talked national as well as Lake Erie. But right in our front yard, we have the Scioto River. And one of the arguments and promotions to taking the dam out of the river was to promote the health of the river. So I'm going to ask the question of, is that really making an impact as we talk about quality, or is it more the aesthetics that we really have going on here? I mean, I certainly love seeing in front of COSI what's emerging is what's going to be an incredible downtown natural landscape with, I think, 33 acres of green space. But in my first question, to get things started, what about the Scioto River and that effort? Is that a good effort? Is it something that should be replicated? So whoever wants to pick up on that. And I also know we were picking up mussels and stuff like that as we were proceeding with that.
Dams are interesting systems. And it's become recently very trendy to remove dams. And for the most part, I would argue it's good. It's important. Dams are big traps of sediment and potentially of contaminants behind the dams. And so when you're talking about within the dam pool, over time, those things can trap things that are in general considered a nuisance to the watershed. There are demonstrable effects. If you measure the quality of water and of the biological communities immediately below dams, they're vastly improved immediately below dams, largely because they're functioning the way the stream should have been without any of the impoundments at all. One of the downsides, though, is those dams, especially as they've been given a lot of time to accumulate those things, accumulate a lot of sediment behind the dam. And that when you breach the dam, you have to account for the fact that there's going to be some degraded water quality downstream of that dam for some time as that sediment is carried away. Sometimes that sediment involves contaminated materials that need to be mitigated as well. There is one downside of dam removal, though, and there's a really good example on the Grand River in Ohio. There's an old mill dam at a place called Harpersville, and that dam is very deliberately maintained. Even though the mill hasn't been operating for decades, that dam is kept there because it prevents sea lamprey, a very aggressive, invasive, parasitic fish, from getting to more spawning habitat. So in general, dam removal good, but nothing is always perfectly good.
That's good. I have a non-scientific answer, and that is that's a big resource, our Scioto River, as it winds through downtown Columbus, and we've seen what other cities have done, San Antonio and others, and we ought to make sure that it has the allure to tourists and local residents, and I think you do that by taking out some of these impoundments.
Well, thank you. Well, it is CMC's tradition to take audience questions. Please step to the microphone, give us your name, and ask your question. And we thank you in advance for not making long editorial comments. Jane, I know that you know that rule well, so we're going to let you start off and model the behavior we'd like to see.
Model the behavior. I love it. I'm Jane Scott. Thank you very much for being here today. Important discussion. Talk a little bit more about what's happening in agriculture. I know there's been some policies that are in the works that Farm Bureau has started, and also OSU Extension is working on some projects. We started talking a little bit about the field to faucet. I'm curious, someplace early in the conversation we talked about farming practices and motivating farmers to do the right thing. I grew up in agriculture. I know they want to do the right thing. How are we proceeding in terms of educating and helping them understand how to help correct these problems?
Well, our OSU extension is a big part of that. And I think there's a number of indications right now that we're having a lot of success. Again, when we first started explaining this problem to farmers, there were, again, complete denial. The last surveys that we've done now show that the farming community, I believe it's 77% of the farmers not only recognize that they are the problem, but that they're ready to take the actions to prevent it. Now, some of the actions to be taken, you've probably heard about the 4 R's. And basically, it's a simple strategy. You want to encourage farmers to put on the right amount of phosphorus. We know that 30% of the fields in Ohio, and this is not just up at the lake, but just sort of a broad forecast, have more phosphorus on them than they need. So don't apply more than is needed for maximum crop production. Apply it at the right time and apply it in the right way. We can reduce the amount of phosphorus coming off fields by incorporating that phosphorus into the soil in some fashion without eliminating no-till farming, keep both practices in place, not apply on frozen and snow-covered ground. These are some of the actions that were just required in some of the recent legislation.
And they're going back to the classroom as well through a program adopted by the General Assembly, and with the support of the farm organizations. Farmers are required to go to school to get a fertilizer certificate, FERT-Cert for shorthand, which is basically fertilizer application 101 and 202, and they're all required to do it over the course of the next several years.
Up to Stone Laboratory for a number of years. We have a lot of farmers coming up there now so that they can better understand the impact of phosphorus leaving their fields. They see what's happening in the lake. They're clearly interested in doing the right thing.
Great.
That fertilizer certification, too, I'd like to add, is been made as painless as possible by attaching it to pesticide recertification, which has been in place for a very long time. So they're already used to going to these training sessions.
Great. Wonderful. Next question.
Afternoon. How are you guys? Thanks so much for being here. I'm Robert Reed. I'm currently an intern at the ODNR. And my question for you is, I'm a fisherman, and I'm not in agriculture or industry, but what, if anything, can we do as, fishermen or regular, not agriculture-related people to help Buckeye Lake and Lake Erie to reduce, algae?
So directly through the activity of fishing, that's a long stretch.
Or anything,
But
anything related.
anything to reduce your input of phosphorus. I can say as a fisherman, though, that you have very direct ability to limit the spread of invasive species, for example. And there are a couple of campaigns that I'm mandated by grant to discuss about. So one I would suggest you look into is the Stop Aquatic Hitchhikers campaign, which you can find by going on the web to protectyourwaters.net. And it's a very simple message. So any equipment you have on the water, before you move it to another body of water, you clean that equipment, you drain all the water from that equipment, you allow that equipment to dry up to 5 days. So that you're limiting the likelihood of moving potentially invasive organisms like the veligers of zebra mussels that are very small and are easy to move in bait buckets, like viral hemorrhagic septicemia, a viral disease. Again, if you release bait, you have the potential to be moving very dangerous diseases between water bodies. So regarding invasive species, I think that's an easy call to make. You have a lot of potential to reduce that problem yourself as a fisherman, as a boater.
A couple other things. If you're going to be a boater, say on Lake Erie, make sure that you're docking at what's designated as a clean marina. A clean marina has to go through 39 steps, past 39 different best management practices that result in reducing the runoff, reducing their input of that marina into Lake Erie, and also become a clean boater. You can go onto our website and determine both how to become a clean boater and which are I believe there are 43 clean marinas now on the Lake Erie shoreline. And that program is just now going statewide. So if you're anywhere in the state, be sure that you're docking at a clean marina. As an individual, we were lucky. We worked with Scott's Miracle Grow to encourage them to remove phosphorus from their lawn care products. They did that effective January 2013. So if you're putting fertilizer on your lawn, any of the 4 steps processes that you could get at Home Depot or Lowe's, make sure that the NPK ratio, the 3 numbers that you see on your bag of fertilizer, make sure the middle number is a 0. Scotts has removed it from all their products, and they're big enough that 95% of the market should follow suit. When I've gone into Lowe's and Home Depot, that's what I see. Also, make sure your septic tank's working. Make sure you use it using low phosphorus cleaners. And if you're in a system, if you're in a city sewer system, very few easy steps. City sewer systems have permits to discharge a certain concentration of phosphorus, some amount per gallon. Therefore, if you reduced your water consumption by 50%, sent only half as many gallons to the sewage treatment plant, you have reduced your phosphorus input by 50%. I've done it at my home simply by putting in low-flow shower heads and low-flow toilets. Humorous aspect maybe, but often on low-flow toilets we used to worry, are these things going to work well enough? If you go into Home Depot, you'll find one that advertises that it'll flush a gallon or it'll flush a bucket of golf balls.
Which we all put in our toilets.
Well, I saw that and thought, well, that'll probably do. You know.
A lot of practical ideas. Thank you for your question. Next.
I'm Kevin Bragg. I'm an attorney with Shoemaker, Loop, and Kendrick. And when I play golf metaphorically, my golf ball is always in the toilet. So one thing you've pointed out is that we do have water. And I did read in the paper the other day that out in the West, where they're having a great drought, that their percentage over, I think it's over the average snow melt that they have, that so much of their water supply is 0% this year. They just don't have any. So at least we have, these problems to talk about as opposed to the problem of if we don't have any water, we have to start with that as well, how do we get some? But my question is more specific than that is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers dredges, my understanding, is about 1 million cubic tons of sediment out of the Maumee River every year, and that the vast majority of that is then open dumped into Lake Erie, and that's been examined and thought about a lot as to impacting what the conditions are creating out there. If you guys could just talk a little bit about how that would impact the lake, what could perhaps be done to mitigate that or at least reduce it, and is achieving the 40% reduction that the doctor talked about achievable if there isn't anything done with that? If that just keeps going on, could you even have a chance to get to the 40%?
Couple of points. It's 1 million cubic yards, actually 1.2 million cubic yards. And the reason that is that one of the largest ports on the Great Lakes is at Toledo. But Toledo's at the far western end. The western end is the shallowest end of Lake Erie. So to keep a port open for large freighters, they need to dredge to 28 feet. Average depth of the whole basin is 24 feet. To keep that port open, they have to dredge 20 miles each year. So they dredge 1 million cubic yards, and each year open lake dispose that. Not a real large concentration of phosphorus, and when you look at each individual cubic yard meets the definition, quote unquote, of clean. But when you take 1 million cubic yards, then you have a relatively large total quantity of phosphorus. You have a large total quantity of arsenic and a number of other things that goes in. So not doing that would be important. We have funded a research project through our Sea Grant program with Dr. Libby Dayton at Ohio State. She's taken that, shown how you can take the dredged material, blend it with a number, sometimes as simple as leaf products, leaf waste and other materials, and produce very valuable agricultural soil. So we're hopeful that we can come up with some other strategies. That will ultimately be eliminated as a result of Senate Bill 1. I think it's about a 5-year process, maybe more than that. Eugene, you might know. I'm not sure.
The process length, yeah.
And the Port Authority at Toledo has used the disposal facilities, confined disposal facilities, to generate new land in the areas around the mouth, and that's also been done over in Cleveland. And there's hundreds of acres of basically dredge that are supporting development of those towns and cities. The Cleveland Brown Stadium now sits on a disposal site.
Thank you. All right, next question, please.
Hi, I'm David Rudder. I'm the Watershed Coordinator at Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. We've talked a lot about what our current conditions are and what's leading to these problems. What is being done to look at the impacts of a changing climate that might exacerbate these issues, both of invasive species as well as nutrient?
That's a great question. When I think about the biggest issues impacting Lake Erie, I always think of sedimentation, nutrient loading, harmful algal blooms, dead zone. It's a cold bottom layer becomes anoxic in the bottom of the Central Basin, aquatic invasive species, and climate change. Climate change impacts all those. We know that about 90% of the phosphorus that comes into Lake Erie comes in during rain events. If we're thinking that the majority of phosphorus comes in from farm fields, well, think about that for a second. It means that when it's not raining, there's no phosphorus coming in off a farm field. It's only going to come in during a rain event. And when we have a 1-inch gentle rain, you don't get any load because it sinks in. But when you have a storm like we did about 3 days ago, when you get 5 inches overnight, you get a huge load of phosphorus with that. And when we look over the last 50 years, the frequency of storms that produce more than 3 inches of rain in a 24-hour period has gone up somewhere between 37 and 53%, depending on which one of the databases we look at. So climate change has a huge impact. We know the harmful forms of algae, the blue-greens, the cyanobacteria, the more accurate name, they like warm water. They need really warm water. So that's part of the impact, but the more important part of the impact is the increased frequency of severe storms.
Sure. And so you make the water on average over the course of a year warmer, you are lengthening the potential growing period for those harmful algal blooms. Also, a couple of species of Asian carps, especially the silver and the bighead carp, get a lot of news frequently. There's a lot of debate regarding whether or not these animals could reproduce. These are potentially invasive fish that are really efficient at eating plankton. There's a lot of debate regarding whether or not they could successfully reproduce in much of the Great Lakes tributaries. They need very long rivers, they need high water that's high at a warm time of year. Most of the Great Lakes don't deliver that. What does deliver that is western Lake Erie, especially the Maumee, perhaps the Sandusky, and there are more and more research through modeling that confirm that reproduction in these sites is likely. at least in some years. And just a very small change in temperature very substantially increases the number of years where reproduction is likely.
Fascinating, thank you. And it's time for one last question, which works out perfectly because we have one last person lined up. So please.
My name's Nancy McLeese. I'm a resident of Indian Lake. Back in the 80s, two grassroots organizations were formed by volunteers. One is the Watershed, and the other one's the Development Corporation. We don't have algae problem because we've worked with the farmers all these years. Why don't the other inland lakes have some grassroots input other than just looking to the state to say, fix my problem? Ours has gone in the other direction. They had to purchase an underwater grass cutter because the sunlight penetrates all the way down and we have grass growing in the lake, so to keep the boating channels open, they have to go through and cut the grass, but no algae, and it's been done without taxpayer money. So.
That's a great success story. And of course, Indian Lake, when Grand Lake St. Mary's had such difficulty, the recreation around Indian Lake cashed in pretty big by people who would ordinarily have spent their recreational time on Grand Lake moving to Indian Lake. Now, there are grassroots organizations on those other sites, but they're both geologically different and the watersheds are different as well. So you've got a very nice situation in Indian Lake. There are those organizations on the other sites, but perhaps they haven't been as effective just because the watersheds are so substantially different.
Yeah, I'm not here to look for more people to come because between Buckeye and Grand Lake, it's packed on the weekends.
Well,
Thank you.
Unfortunately, you've made a very good sales pitch.
I hope you enjoyed today's forum. And remember that you can view and share all of our forums on CTV, Columbus Television, on WOSU and PBS affiliates statewide through the Ohio Channel, and anytime on CMC's website via YouTube. Before we conclude, please help me thank our sponsor, The Ohio State University, and our speakers, Jeffrey Reuter, Eugene Bragg, Tony Logan, and David Chesbrow. And thanks to all of you for being here, and we look forward to seeing you in the future.